Good morning, all. May I invite you all to please take your seat as we like to begin this morning's proceedings. Thank you. Just to give you a minute. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and a warm welcome to all of you to the April South Asia Development Update and the Sri Lanka Development Update, jointly launched in collaboration between the South Asia Regional Chief Economist Office and the Sri Lanka Macroeconomics Public Sector Trade and Investment Team and the External Communications Team. The two reports are launched today in partnership with Avocata Institute, a local think tank specializing on state-owned enterprise reforms, trade reforms, and the overall public policy advocacy, and the Sri Lanka Press Institute, a media development institute representing print and broadcast media. We're truly honored to have you all with us here this morning, ladies and gentlemen. A set of mix that we have here from the private and public sector, think tanks, professionals, students, and policymakers. We also say a very special welcome to the Governor of Central Bank, Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe, for gracing us here this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, the event will be presided over with two short presentations, which will be on SADU and SLDU, which will be followed by a panel discussion and a Q&A session as well. Now, to begin this morning's proceedings, I have the pleasure of inviting the Country Director for the World Bank for Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, who joins us from Nepal, I believe. Could you please put your hands together for Mr. Faris Haddad Zavos, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me, and I guess it would be afternoon there. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a technical issue. I'm trying to sort it now. I'm hearing the echo, and I'm trying to sort out how to fix it. Okay, thank you very much. I'm very delighted to be with you here, and very delighted to welcome the Governor of the Central Bank, my dear friend, Mr. Nandalal. It's an honor to inaugurate the launch of the Sri Lanka Development Update alongside with the regional SADU, as my colleague said, the South Asia Development Update in Colombo. This occasion is especially significant as it marks the first time the regional update is launched in Sri Lanka and the first in-person dissemination of the SLDU in 4 years, actually. And I'm really grateful to the Chief Economist for South Asia, my colleague and friend, Francesco Norghi, for allowing us to say that, and that's I think really emblematic. These reports are designed to offer insights into the recent economic developments in Sri Lanka and the broader South Asia region, framing them within a backdrop of long-term trends and the global economic landscape. They provide, as you'll see, a forward-looking analysis of the region's economies, cast within the global context, of course, with the Sri Lanka Development Update offering a focused examination of Sri Lanka's, specifically its economic progress. And I think the title of the Sri Lanka, that section, the thematic report, the title is very apropos, Bridge to Recovery. The SLDU being launched today highlights Sri Lanka's journey, a very difficult but a hopeful one, towards economic recovery, emphasizing three key messages, and I'll talk to them generally, as I'm sure you'll enjoy the detailed presentation that will be given. The first is stability is a foundation for recovery. Colleagues, as you know, Sri Lanka's economy is showing signs of stabilization after the challenges of 2022, evidenced by reduced economic contraction. For 2023, it's 2.3%. Single-digit inflation, lower interest rates, and a current account surplus, the first since 1977. Tourism is thriving, and foreign reserves have reached approximately $3.1 billion. So this is important. Stability is a foundation for recovery. The second is the key message on the importance of addressing the human costs, the vast human cost of the crisis. Despite these macroeconomic gains, the average citizen continues to face tremendous hardships. The economic adjustments have led to increased poverty, which has risen 4 consecutive years to reach almost 26%, 25.9%, from 11.3% in 2019. Unemployment and inequality have also increased. The path, therefore, to recovery must include not only economic measures, but also adequate social support for the most affected populations of the country and throughout the country. And third is a tremendously important issue, and that is the importance of continuity and continuation of reforms as a bridge to prosperity. The ongoing reforms in debt management, fiscal policy, trade, investment, and state-owned enterprises are absolutely crucial. To move beyond the crisis and prevent stagnation of the economy, Sri Lanka must maintain the momentum of these reforms and the credibility of these reforms to not only propel the country towards recovery, but address the structural constraints and the structural legacy of governance weaknesses that got us to this situation in the first place. Turning back is not an option, or is certainly not a reasonable, sane option at this point. Sustainable growth is key to reducing poverty, and the commitment to reforms must persist. Colleagues, I don't want to speak at length because I know we want to hear from the speakers, but I just want to express appreciation to the teams who worked on both the SLDU and the SADU to provide timely insights into the macroeconomic outlook, to address the issues, importance of private sector development, poverty reduction strategy, and the importance of growth-enhancing reforms. What you will see also in the South Asia Development Update that our chief economist has been rolling out in South Asia is the continued critical role of job creation. That is extremely relevant to Sri Lanka. And last but not least, the panel discussion today is one that I always look forward to and allows us to really delve deeper into these issues and have a discussion. I want to thank you again. I want to thank all the participants, colleagues from civil society, from media, Governor of Central Bank, members of the government of Sri Lanka for their presence. And I very much look forward to the proceedings. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Farid Sadat Zawaz, for joining us online. Ladies and gentlemen, the first presentation will be covering on South Asia Development Update. She's the World Bank's chief economist for South Asia, covering Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. She's been at the bank for more than 10 years. Could you please put your hands together for Ms. Francisca Ozon?
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure and it's a privilege to be here today with you. A big thank you also to my friend Farid Sadat Zawaz for making this possible. It wouldn't have been possible without his big push and his team, his country team. Thank you also to Avocata and the Sri Lanka Press Institute for making this happen. South Asia, there we go. South Asia is the bright spot in the global economy. Growth in South Asia is the fastest of any emerging market and developing economy region. But, there's a but, and the chart on the left shows you the but. The first 3 bars shows you South Asia as a whole. The second set of bars on the left show you without India. That strength, that strong growth in South Asia, that is almost entirely due to India. Once you take out India, South Asia is growing pretty much like everyone else, like all the other emerging markets and developing economies. And that is in part because the region has 3 countries that fall into the 1/4 of emerging market and developing economies that have been or are financially stressed. Those countries are struggling to come out of their recessions last year. So you can see that here in the chart in the center. The 3 financially stressed countries in South Asia and the other financially stressed countries in other emerging markets and developing economies. They are all recovering. In South Asia also they're recovering, but it's not a strong rebound. It's a recovery. It's a recovery like elsewhere that will have to be sustained. The other catch to the bright spot theory is the role of government. The chart on the right here shows you that more than in other emerging markets and developing economies, growth in South Asia has been supported by the public sector. Private investment, meanwhile, has been languishing. The chart on the left shows you private investment growth. The chart in the center shows you private investment as a share of GDP. So if you start on the left, yes, private investment growth in South Asia is stronger than in other emerging markets and developing economies because these economies are growing faster than the rest of the world. But it's a big slowdown from the pre-pandemic trends. And in addition, this is not just a weakness of the post-pandemic period. This is something that has been going on for a decade, this private investment weakness. And that's what the point of the chart in the center is. As a share of GDP, private investment actually contributes less in South Asia and has been contributing less for a decade now than in other emerging markets and developing economies. You can see that small center bar here in the chart in the center. That weak private investment weakness, we'll come to that later, translates also into weak job creation, and it makes it more difficult for firms to adapt to climate change. What would it take to kick off a sustained acceleration in private investment? So we estimate the preconditions that have to be in place, or that when they are in place, make it more likely that a sustained private investment acceleration over 8 years on average, that such an acceleration takes place. And it turns out there are 3 factors that are strongly associated with a sustained private investment acceleration over multiple years, almost a decade. One is trade, another is capital account openness, the third one is institutional improvements, and the fourth one, which is not relevant for the whole region, but parts of the region, is a well-aligned exchange rate. An exchange rate is aligned with fundamentals. Just to illustrate the first 2, the region really stands out, and this is a theme throughout the report and previous reports as well. South Asia stands out for its closeness to international trade and capital flows. So two numbers here for you to take away, just to put it in context. The chart on the right, the blue bars show you the trade to GDP ratio in South Asia and the average emerging market. And it shows you a capital account openness, a standard index of capital account openness. You can see that the trade to GDP ratio in South Asia is almost 30 percentage points of GDP less than in the average emerging market. That's a lot. And the capital openness is about half. That index is about half of what it is in the average emerging market and developing economy. So our estimates suggest that if South Asia managed to simply raise its trade to GDP ratio and its capital account openness to the emerging market and developing economy average, it could raise the probability of sparking a sustained private investment acceleration by almost 1/2. Now, without robust private investment, without robust private investment, it's difficult to see how the region's firms can adapt to climate change and many other things. Know how they can raise productivity growth, how they can raise employment creation. But here I want to focus on climate adaptation. Just as a reminder, we have the chart on the left. This is a standard index of climate vulnerability that was developed by the University of Notre Dame in the US. And it shows very clearly that South Asia is the most vulnerable emerging market and developing economy region to climate change. On average, over the past decade, 60 million people per year have been affected by climate disasters, natural disasters. That's an average. So it's not the same 60 million people every year. It's a lot more because that shock moves around the region. So climate adaptation is a priority for the region. It tends to also, we show in this report, it tends to hurt poor households more. They tend to suffer more from climate shocks. Even if they're not always more exposed, they certainly suffer more from climate shocks. So climate adaptation is a priority for the region, and it's good development policy too for the region. But Governments, I don't have to tell people in Sri Lanka especially, governments are severely constrained in what they can do across South Asia. Fiscal positions across South Asia are fragile. Debt is high, revenues are low, well below the average, and borrowing costs tend to be higher in the region as well. So there are limits. The government policy is severely constrained, which means that climate adaptation will fall on the private sector. And that means households, firms, and farms. So what we have done here, we have looked at how does the private sector adapt to climate change? Which strategies do they use? They use a myriad of strategies. So the firms adopt technologies, cooling, for example. Farmers might adopt new seeds. Households might look for a job outside agriculture. They might migrate. So there's a wide range of policies. What we have done is we've taken all the evidence across the whole world, every study we could find on climate adaptation, and we've seen how effective was it? And the way we capture this, because there are all sorts of outcomes that have been examined. There's been mortality, income losses, education losses. So to collapse all of this into one metric, that was a tricky thing to do. We've collapsed all of this into the adaptation ratio. It measures how much of the damage of climate shocks can be offset by a particular strategy. Yeah, so adaptation ratio of 1 basically means that the climate damage is completely offset by this particular strategy employed by this particular group of people and households or firms. And here the main takeaway is that the center chart. Firms are actually not that bad at climate adaptation. On average, they can offset almost 3/4 of a climate shock, of the damage from a climate shock. That's because they have access to finance, they have access to markets, they can borrow from suppliers, they have ways of adapting, especially new technologies. So that can be cooling, for example, when there's a heat wave, so you don't have the productivity losses that happen when it's very hot. So firms are actually not so bad at adapting to climate change. Who's really struggling are households and firms. They can only offset of the climate damage 1/3 to about a half. And the reason they are so bad at it is that without the government, if there's no government to help them, they have to resort to labor market adjustments. They have to move. They have to find jobs and activities outside the agricultural sector. And I will show you in the next slide, and that's the in-depth topic, the deep dive of this report. It's that non-agricultural sector that is just not very welcoming to people shifting into it, trying to shift into it. So for them, one of the most effective policies for climate adaptation remains the public sector, public goods and services. See in the chart on the right here, the reason it's so much higher than labor markets is that it's really benefiting households who otherwise have very few, households and farmers, who otherwise have very few ways of adapting to climate change. And these public goods in the chart on the right, they are the traditional kind of public goods. This is old-fashioned, plain vanilla, bread and butter development. Yeah, this is bridges that allow people to access markets or jobs when there's flooding. This is piped water that runs clean even when there's flooding. This is the local clinic that helps reduce child mortality when there's a heat wave. This is old-fashioned development. This is not even the fancy new development that raises roads. This is just development, public goods and services that help especially households and farmers who have otherwise very few strategies to adapt to climate change. And now let me get to why it's so difficult for households and farmers to adapt to climate change. So I told you that their main strategy, at least in that literature we've surveyed, is to move out of agriculture into non-agriculture. This is part of the development process. This is the structural transformation. No? This is how development should work. There should be two wheels to it. One is that people move out of agriculture. The second wheel is that people move into non-agriculture. It turns out that the main reason why employment is weak in South Asia is that that second wheel is not working. But before we get there, let me just tell you why employment is weak. We're deliberately here looking at employment ratios. If we were in any other region, we would be just looking at employment growth, for example. But in this region, South Asia, there is still very rapid, or above average working age population growth. So it's not good enough to just generate jobs. The region has to generate enough jobs to absorb the rising working age population. And it turns out that in other emerging markets and developing economies, since 2000, the employment ratio has stayed pretty much constant, whereas in South Asia it's dropped. It's dropped to about 10 percentage points. You don't see it here, you see it in the report. I'm trying to be parsimonious here. It's dropped to about more than 10 percentage points below other emerging markets and developing economies. And that is a problem not just for women, that's a long-standing problem, their employment. It's also a problem for men now. Its male employment ratios have fallen. They used to be above the emerging market and developing economy average. Now they're just in line. So it's not just women who are struggling to find employment. It is also men now who are increasingly struggling to find employment. This is a broad-based issue around South Asia. And it turns out the reason this is happening, this employment weakness, is because of this broken structural transformation. So here in the chart on the left, you see the agricultural employment ratio, and in the center, you can see the non-agricultural employment ratio. You can see that agriculture is working fine. It's doing what agriculture does and should do. It's shedding jobs, just like everywhere else. If anything, maybe a little less than everywhere else. But agriculture is pretty much doing what it does during the process of development. It's non-agriculture. That's where the problem lies. So the chart in the center shows you that at this point, the non-agricultural sector in South Asia employs 17 percentage points of the working age population, less than in other emerging markets and developing economies. And that gap is growing. And it's not just a little gap. First is a big gap. That's the point of the chart on the right. And it's across the region. I mean, the region is very diverse. They don't have many commonalities, a lot of these countries. But one commonality they have is the weak employment ratios among women, we know that, but also in the non-agricultural sector. In the chart on the right, the red band shows you the interquartile range of other emerging markets and developing economies. All South Asian countries other than Maldives have non-agricultural employment ratios below the red band, i.e. in the bottom quartile. So it's across the region that the non-agricultural sector is not creating enough jobs. So then we go into some depth, which I won't go into here, I'll just summarize, into what are the drivers of weak employment ratios. And we find a multitude of drivers that hold in parts of the region, are challenges part of the region. But there are three drivers that apply to most of the region. So these are small firm size, weak trade to GDP ratio, you already saw that, and low education. That is also true for most countries in the region, not all of them, and in some ways Sri Lanka is an exception. But just to come back to the firm size, in the majority of countries in South Asia, the ones you see here in the chart on the right, the average firm size is, again, in the bottom quartile, in the smallest 25% of emerging markets and developing economies in South Asia. And it turns out that this is strongly correlated with lower employment ratios. So that takes me then to the policy recommendations, that the natural policy recommendation is then spur firm growth, vibrant, competitive growth, firms, anything that can make firms grow. Competition makes firms grow. Access to markets makes firms grow. So to summarize, last slide here, what's the growth outlook for South Asia? Better than other emerging markets and developing economies, but mostly because of India, and is more reliant on the public sector than in other emerging markets and developing economies. And risks remain to the downside, including, especially in South Asia, because of climate risks, climate shocks. Now, with governments being very fiscally constrained, really the burden of climate adaptation falls on the private sector. Firms have ways to do that. Households are really left on their own if there's no government to support them. They really don't have any other good strategies, in part because the non-agricultural sector is so difficult to find a job in. And there's a number of features of South Asia that are correlated, that are probably underlying this weakness in non-agricultural employment creation. and in particular obstacles to firm growth. And there are many obstacles to firm growth. It could be land market, labor markets, it could be product market, lack of competition, access to finance. But what stands out in the region is really the small firm size, and small firms don't generate as many jobs as rapidly growing firms that move from small to mid-sized. So the policy implication is, our last chapter is a big call for spurring policies to spur firm growth. That could be trade. Trade brings competition. Trade opens markets, increases market size. That could be taking out the sand in the wheels of land markets, of labor markets, that allow firms to grow, to gather the other inputs that help them employ workers and generate output. And that will then have positive benefits, this firm growth, for job creation, private investment as well, output growth and climate adaptation, especially by firms. And I invite you all to download the report, and all the details are available under this link. Thank you.
The South Asian Development Report for you, ladies and gentlemen, by Ms. Francisca Onsonge. We now take a look at the Sri Lankan Development Report, ladies and gentlemen. Our presenter is the senior economist in macroeconomics, public sector, trade and investment practice of the bank, covering Sri Lanka and the Maldives, and he has been at the bank for more than 6 years. Could you please put your hands together for Mr. Richard Walker?
Thanks. Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to the launch of the Sri Lankan Development Update. So there's a lot in the report. I'll just try and go through a few highlights and dig into a few other things in a bit more detail. So the key messages, there are three really. The economy is stabilizing. High poverty, inequality, and vulnerability persist despite these macroeconomic gains. And the final message is around sustained support for the poor and continued commitment to reforms are an essential bridge to the recovery and prosperity, which Faris emphasized earlier. So the economy is stabilizing. Just a few points to make here. So firstly, growth turned positive in the second half of 2023. You can see in this chart shows quarterly growth, 2022 and 23. You can see the sharp contraction across all sectors and obviously the overall economy going through 22 and into 23. And you see in the final half of 23 some positive growth. So these green shoots starting to show themselves, particularly in the services sector, some industries, and in food and beverage products. Some of this supported by the revival in tourism. Just to flag one sector that hasn't shown much recovery yet is the construction sector. So that's the red segment of the column there. You can see how it was also hit quite hard during the crisis and as yet is not showing any sort of positive growth signs. So in summary, you see for 2023, there still was this contraction of about 2.3%, which was smaller than the contraction in 2022 of about 7.3%. The next point here is that external balances are improving. So just one headline figure we show is around the rebound in tourism. You can see the depths of the COVID crisis where it basically went to zero, actually went to zero for a few months. There was some recovery and then we headed into the economic crisis around March, April, May of 22 there. And following that, you can see some recovery and a particularly sharp rebound towards the end of last year. And this, together with the boost in remittances, relatively low levels of imports, there were restrictions, as well as flows from IMF, ADB, World Bank. It's still on my screen. There it's back. This has led to this current account surplus for the first time since about 1977. And as a result, you see reserves, forex reserves are being rebuilt from the lows of middle of 22, around 300 million, 1 to 2 weeks of imports, up to about $3 billion at the end of last year, or around 2 months of imports. So significant improvement there. And with this increased liquidity, you see the rupee has appreciated by almost 11% in 2023, and you've seen the continued appreciation into 2024. The next point is around inflation, and interest rates are declining. So the slowdown in inflation has largely been driven by the rupee appreciation, monetary tightening, and muted demand. And you can see this chart from about September 22, where it reached a peak of around 70% inflation. It's dipped all the way down to single digits from about the middle of 23. And as a result, this has allowed the central bank now to move into a loosening cycle, and policy rates have been reduced quite substantially over the last 8 months or so, with the recent reduction March this year by about 50 basis points. And given this, you've seen this decline in market interest rates, with a particularly acute or sharp fall at the short end of the curve of about 20% when you're looking at T-bills, 91-day T-bills. This is in the last year from March, the blue line there really from March 23 to February 24, so significant change there. From all of this, you expect, or what we would expect, and what we've seen is a slight uptick in private credit growth from about the middle of 23. Again, another green shoot coming through. Fiscal balance imbalances are also being corrected. So this chart shows revenue as a share of GDP over the last 2 decades. You can see that solid decline till about 2022, and the sharp jump from about 8.4% of GDP to 11%, which the single largest, actually we say 2 decades there, but you look at the data, it goes back even 3 decades. So this, together with curtailed spending, has led to this primary balance surplus. I guess what's key there is the blue column and orange column. This narrowing in 2023, or the gap between them, has led to this primary surplus just dipping above the line there, although the overall balance still remains negative due to the high interest bill. So despite some degree of macro stability, we still see Sri Lanka's path to recovery remaining narrow. So we project growth to be positive this year, and more moderate over the medium term, certainly not a quick bounce back. This chart just gives a sense of the sectors of how they've been hit over the last few years. You can see, at least in nominal terms, industry has been the most effective, and in terms of value output is well below where it was 2017, 2018, 2019, and the outlook is not necessarily too favorable given the scarring effects of the crisis, the ongoing fiscal adjustment, lower real incomes, and immigration of skilled workers. So just a few other macro indicators. Inflation, we expect it to rise moderately in the near term and remain benign over the medium term. Current account is projected to be in surplus in 24 as tourism recovers and remittances remain buoyant. And we expect this accumulation of forex to continue in line with the IMF program and the commitments from government to rebuild these buffers effectively. Which brings me to risks. For sure, we see certainly downside risks remain high, especially, as I said, with limited buffers. And I think 2 I just want to emphasize here. Firstly is the upcoming election. We're concerned about, say, reform fatigue and reform reversal and what this might mean for the recovery. And that's why we talk about this bridge to recovery. And a key aspect of the bridge is staying on the reforms. The second one to highlight, of course, is this potentially protracted or insufficiently deep debt restructuring. We certainly wouldn't see several rounds of a restructuring required in order for the economy to get back properly on its feet. And then finally, an important point here is we're concerned about the continuing and lasting impact on the poor. Which brings me to the second point. High poverty, inequality, and vulnerability certainly persist despite the macroeconomic gains. You see poverty has increased for 4 consecutive years now, from about 11%, this is under the low middle income poverty threshold, to about 26% estimated in 2023. Linking a bit to what Francisco was saying, labor force participation has worsened over the last few years, particularly in urban areas, you see, falling from above 50% around 2019 to below 45% towards the second half of 2023. And very concerning from some of the survey data shows is that households are taking on debt to meet several sort of requirements. This is what this chart shows, but most concerning for us is that bottom bar to meet daily food requirements. You find about 23% of households are taking on debt just to meet their food requirements. And given this scenario and the fact that growth is projected to be relatively moderate, we are concerned about how these welfare losses through the crisis, through COVID, are going to be reversed. Which brings me to the final message around the reforms. So we see support for the poor, a commitment to reforms as key planks of this bridge to recovery and prosperity. And I'll just touch on 3 reform areas that we see as important. The first is around improving economic governance. So there has been some progress here. Certainly the government is making efforts to improve public financial management. There's been efforts to improve the performance, reduce the risks and vulnerabilities in the financial sector. There's been a raft of new tax policy measures and other measures announced in the different budgets. But there's still a lot to be done. One area we think is around debt management, an issue that led into this crisis, the need to improve institutions, improve the framework for managing debt. There's work ongoing, but this needs to be seen through. And then in terms of revenue mobilization, it's not just about putting up tax rates, trying to generate more revenue from the same taxpayers. It's about improving administration, trying to broaden the base, and effectively make it a lot more equitable. This chart at the bottom just gives quite a sort of dire sense of where Sri Lanka has reached this red line, trended all the way down and is at the moment at about, or at 2021, roughly 8%, well below the average in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia of around 13%, and then in East Asia and Pacific closer to 18%. And then finally, of course, linked to all this, there's a raft, I can say, of governance reforms that still need to be implemented, and we would like to see this momentum sustained. The second area of reforms is around enhancing competitiveness. There are 2 aspects I want to highlight here. First is state-owned enterprises. We see this as critical to address some of these issues in terms of enhancing competitiveness. There's been some progress. There was the Sri Lanka state-owned enterprise reform policy approved last year. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of debate around SOE reforms, what needs to happen, what needs to be done. There's even this expectation that a new SOE reform law will come into being around May this year. And we would like to see this momentum continue, really to improve the governance of SOEs, to improve transparency, to improve performance, and also to look at options for private participation. Another issue, and this also links to what Francisca was saying, was Sri Lanka has become far more inward-orientated with this complex and fragmented investment environment, which really makes it difficult for firms to invest and thrive. This chart just gives a sense, really one indicator, of an index of missing exports. So when you estimate Sri Lanka's export potential, in 2021, there was about $10 billion of missing exports. So this really is, what is required here is a concerted effort to enhance trade, investment policies to really, at the end of the day, ensure a much more dynamic and competitive economy. And the final area is around protecting the poor and vulnerable. You've seen some of the messages earlier. There has been some progress in establishing this new welfare benefit payment scheme to enhance the targeting, the coverage. Work has happened, but more needs to be done to ensure that the poor and the vulnerable are continued to be supported in this crisis. The delivery systems, the institutions, better targeting, it's all work in progress. And then finally, an area which we see as a significant potential growth dividend for Sri Lanka is women empowerment and encouraging women entrepreneurship, gender equality. So again, here there's been some progress. There are these 2 bills we understand are in Parliament now gender equality bill, women empowerment. But again, more needs to be done to ensure that women basically have equal economic citizenship and can contribute to this recovery, to this prosperity of Sri Lanka. So that, in a nutshell, is the report. There's a lot more detail in there. We'd welcome any questions, and please download it, and you can understand some of the messages further. Thanks.
Mr. Walker, can I invite you to remain on stage as we move on to a photo opportunity now, and we would like to invite Ms. Francisca Onzonge to join on stage as well, together with our 4 panelists who are joining us here this morning. Mr. Murtaza Jafferji, the chairman of Advocata Institute, Shamali Ranaraja, the visiting lecturer, Department of Law, University of Peradeniya, and we also invite Dr. Sanjeeva Veeravarna, the chief executive officer and of WSO2, to join us on stage for a group photograph that we'll be taking. We also invite our moderator, Mr. Gregory Smith, the lead economist for Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka of the World Bank, to please. We'll be taking a quick photograph in support for our media journalists. Yes, and there are a few others, ladies and gentlemen, whom we'd like to invite for a photo opportunity, and that is the country manager for the World Bank and the Maldives, Sri Lanka, Ms. Chiokanda, and the chief executive officer of the Press Institute of Sri Lanka, Mr. Kumar Lopez. The launch of both reports, ladies and gentlemen. Can we put our hands together and give them a round of applause as we take a group photograph? Thank you very much. You may take your seat now, ladies and gentlemen, as we set the stage for the panel discussion, which is on the pathways to prosperity, boosting employment and productivity for an economic growth. Ladies and gentlemen, please give me a moment to take a minute to introduce you to our panelists in a more wider spectrum. Our panelist, the chairman of Advocata Institute, is an investment professional who covers over 25 years of industry experience and has previously been a director of the Colombo Stock Exchange, the Nations Trust Bank, and Serendip Hotels PLC. He was also the past president of CFA Society of Sri Lanka and a local member of the Society of CFA Institute, and also held the advocacy chair, whose responsibilities include promoting good ethical practices. We say a warm welcome to our panelist, Mr. Murtaza Jafferji. Ladies and gentlemen, with your applause. And our next panelist, ladies and gentlemen, the visiting lecturer of the Department of Law, University of Peradeniya, and who covers over 30 years of experience as a practitioner focusing on labor and employment law, human resources management, gender and equality, and migration for employment, as a consultant to Sri Lankan and international agencies on the research related to the world of work. She has had her research published both nationally and internationally, and she is the current visiting lecturer of the Department of Law. Could we please put our hands together for Shamali Ranaraja? Our next panelist, ladies and gentlemen, received a PhD in computer science from Purdue University in 1994, and after 3 years as a visiting faculty he worked at IBM T.J. Watson Research Center in New York for 8 years, and he returned to Sri Lanka in the year 2001, where he started WSO2 and serves as its CEO and Chief Product Officer. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please put your hands together for Dr. Sanjeeva Veeravarna. And our moderator, ladies and gentlemen, the lead economist in the macroeconomics, public sector, trade and investment practice of the bank, covering Sri Lanka, Maldives and Nepal. Could you please put your hands together for Mr. Gregory Smith. The panel discussion will be on for 40 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, which will be followed by a Q&A session.
And I'd also like to welcome to the panel Dr. Francisco, who can bring us a fantastic regional perspective. Another round of applause, please. What a fascinating report, and look forward to delving into the full details, but the presentations did a fantastic job at outlining the key messages. So let's start at the regional level. And it was so wonderful to hear that the South Asia region is a leading light and growing quite well. But when we look down into the data, we see India is a big driver of that. And we also notice that growth rates are a little slower than pre-pandemic. And Dr. Francisco, I wondered if you could help us understand what factors are contributing to that slightly slower growth.
Thank you. These three of the countries in the region, as I mentioned, are financially stressed, and they're struggling to come out of that recession that came with the financial stress last year. In part because debt is still high, it hasn't been fully resolved, the debt overhangs, or overhang is a strong word, but the high debt. But another reason for the slower growth is the policies that were used to address the balance of payment pressures. So several countries in the region implemented a number of import controls, capital controls, financial restrictions on their banking systems. And even if in some countries they've begun to be unwound, it takes a while for the economic activity to really recover from the disruptions that were caused by these policies. So that is one of the reasons that the region is kind of falling behind what it used to, what we were all used to from before the pandemic.
Thank you very much. And you know, when we sort of moved the lens to Sri Lanka in Richard Walker's presentation, it was great to see that solid growth in the last quarter of 2023 of 4.5%. But then when we look at some of those sectors that are struggling, particularly industry contracting, that's a worry. And I just wanted to ask Mr. Murtaza if you could sort of help us understand some of the barriers the sector faces and what reforms are needed for it to move on to a faster growth trajectory, please.
Thank you, Greg. So first you got to understand what is the composition of the industrial sector. So there is manufacturing, there is construction, there is mining, and there is utilities, electricity generation. And the thing that has held back the industry sector the most is the construction industry has contracted by over 50%. In the decade leading up to the crisis, that was one of the sectors that had the highest amount of growth, and a significant amount of credit was also going into that sector. So if I may say, it was quite literally on steroids, and it's now deeply contracting because it was overstimulated. And it will take a long time for it to recover to where it came from. There was a significant amount of public investment that was also done in that period, which I am afraid that going forward we may not have the fiscal space to invest at that same rate. So the recovery in the construction sector will take a lot longer. Although this quarter has significantly been assisted because last quarter was affected by the rain. We had this extraordinary rain because of an event called the positive Indian Ocean dipole. We experienced extraordinary rain which negated the effect of the El Nino. So we have much drier weather now, and this dry weather will certainly assist that sector. Then you have the manufacturing sector, which part of it is agro-processing, and there will be a strong recovery in agriculture because of the exceptional rains we had and the sunshine that we are having this quarter, which will then spur that industry also to recover. Then you have the electricity generation industry, and the reservoirs were at one of its peak levels ending last year. So there, in my opinion, in the very short term, there will be a recovery. But the question more was with the growth. And here I take on my cap as a businessman. Doing business in Sri Lanka is tough. And that is why when the Center for International Development came down to Sri Lanka and did a diagnostic, what they said was a coordination in government is extremely difficult. Now, I as a businessman invest in renewable energy, you need over 16 permits. God help you if you have to get permits from wildlife and forest, it's extremely difficult basically. Even there is a law that most Sri Lankans recognize called Felling of Trees Act. We know the famous jack tree. Now they have even put coconut trees. So if you have more than 5 coconut trees, you have to go to the Coconut Cultivation Board and get permission from them to cut the trees basically. So there's a lot of barriers basically that goes against businessmen who want to compete on fair terms. And that is why the CID people, including Professor Ricardo Hausmann, they advocated build zones. And they did a diagnostic of the BOI, and they showed that most of our industrial zones are running at 85 to 90% capacity. Because what they showed was out of those 15 or 16 approvals, 5 are already approved, 5 are partially approved, and then you're only left with about 6 approvals that you need to get. So that whole challenge of coordination is simplified by using zones, and that is something they have advocated all over the developing world. Now Sri Lanka has not had many private industrial zones. Most of our zones are with the government through the BOI, and of course the port city is another example of a private zone. So one way to accelerate the industrial sector, especially the manufacturing sector, and also export manufacturing, is to build large number of industrial zones, hopefully run by the private sector, that reduces this coordination challenge.
Thank you very much. The team have done a great job, the World Bank team, crunching the macro numbers, running our macroeconomic model. But I want to sort of understand better, what do these growth numbers translate to on the high street and when you're running a business? So Sanjeeva, these green shoots, are these initial impacts of growth impacting private sector decision making? And is there some confidence coming back?
Certainly, I think it is impacting private sector decision making, and there is significant confidence coming back given the bigger trends around the tourism and the remittances, because those are kind of anchors of our system for a long time. Tourism in particular coming back so strong, even the first quarter, I think we are seeing not record numbers, but near record numbers coming back in first quarter this year. That's very good to see. And there is no indication, barring some kind of black swan event again, that things will slow down in tourism. And tourism obviously carries so many different other areas with it, all the way into construction even. And our capacity for tourism is we are only still pulling in 2 million people, plus or minus a little bit, which, Thailand pulls in 34 million. So we are nowhere near what we can be if we keep going. So I see a overall private sector interest in the positive orientation picking up. Consumer obviously is still struggling, as the numbers you showed as well. The poverty levels and so the pro-poor program is very important in order to keep this bridge to recovery going. But the private industry is definitely picking up. I think credit growth is still slow. It's not taking off yet. Obviously, interest rates have a lot to do with it. But central banks pushing the interest rates down. Banks are responding slowly sometimes, but they need a bit of a nudge. But that push has to happen for it to take off more. So I think it's the right directions we are beginning to see. Delicate line yet, and if you keep going, we'll be in a good direction.
That's great to hear. And one of the statistics put up there about people still needing to borrow to feed their families is so important to how this recovery is designed to improve people's welfare. And I just wanted Shamali to ask you some questions about jobs and employment, and to try and understand what some of the barriers are that Sri Lanka faces in terms of employment, especially in terms of female labour force participation, please.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate at this discussion. I was very interested to see that a recommendation for South Asia is to improve investment. And when you link that to female labor force participation, I want to put the question back to you and ask you, do you think Sri Lanka should improve or increase opportunities for women in employment? And if so, why? well, the obvious answer is yes. And the why is because when you look at the labor force participation rates for men and women across the age groups, you find that in the 25, across all ages, it's women are less than half of the participation rates for men. But particularly in the 25 to 44 age group, the gap is very wide, and the participation of male workers is at 95%. So it is at saturation point. So if you're speaking about investment and job creation and employment growth, then the workers have to come from the female labor force. That is without a doubt a reality. And when you ask me as a lawyer, do I think that the labor laws are what is inhibiting women's labor force participation? I have to tell you that none of the research that has been done identify labor laws as a problem. And to add to the misery of investors that Murtaza was talking about, apart from the 16 permits, you have roughly about 43 labor laws that you have to cope with, 15 of which are in operation on a daily basis, most of which were drafted either before or around the time of independence. If you take this auditorium, you will find that the different categories of workers who are here in their official line, like the press or the hotel staff, Mr. Sanjeeva's staff at his company, they are all covered by different labor laws. So it's very fragmented, and it's difficult for people to understand what is applicable both for employers and employees. But if you ask me, is that what is keeping women out of employment? The short answer is no, because all the available research points to the care responsibilities of women. I teach at a university where more than 95% of enrollment at the final year level is in female undergraduates. But even at that level, they do not translate into employment statistics. So the care responsibility has been identified as the single most significant barrier to women's participation. And the Department of Census and Statistics in their data have found that women on average overall spend more than 4 hours over men in terms of care work in the home. And the unpaid care work is equal to now 14% of GDP. So you can see that it overtakes the contribution of even agriculture in Sri Lanka. So if you ask me what are these are the challenges, what are the solutions, definitely the care responsibility has to be recognized at a state level, at a policy level, to accommodate legal or policy changes to increase women's participation. Care facilities have to be included in terms of child care, easily accessible child care, and elders care. Very often you find workers' organizations and trade unions demanding that employers, especially in the private sector, provide child care in the workplace. This is not practical because, for one thing, child care is something that is specialized, it has to be supervised, and employers do not have the resources to do so. And also, if a female worker or a male worker is working in Colombo and they reside somewhere 2 hours away from Colombo, somewhere in Gampaha, which happens very often, imagine waking up a little child at 5:30 in the morning and putting them in public transport and busing them all the way to Colombo because of child care. So childcare or elders care has to be accessible where workers reside. And you find that the statistics are very clear. Labor force participation is actually lower in the urban areas than in the rural areas or in the state sector. Labor force participation is very high, is higher in those sectors clearly because there is more accessible solutions to care facilities. So these are the issues that really have an impact more than labor law. Very quickly to touch on the labor law reforms that have been proposed by the government. I'm not sure whether there's anyone from the labor ministry here, but if you ask me as a practicing lawyer whether that provides a solution, the short answer again is no, because 13 labor laws have been combined into one labor law of 206 pages and 21 chapters, and I will bet my earnings for last month that no one in this room has read all 206 pages. One, because the main reason is because it is in Sinhala only. There is no official English translation. So what type of consultation has been had on these proposed labor law reforms is a very interesting question. The trade unions have refused to participate, which is not healthy either. But again, how pragmatic these are and what kind of solution you're providing is questionable, because you have to make laws accessible to both employers and employees. The investors are going to need more lawyers, a whole team of lawyers or a department of legal specialists to interpret that 206-page law if it is passed. and the workers will not be able to access it at all. So you're talking about, again, trying to get women into employment when there are very clear restrictions on other areas other than labor law, but also the existing labor law and the labor law that is proposed is not going to have an impact in a positive way. So whether Sri Lanka will achieve those targets in terms of converting investment or encouraging investment through getting more female workers means that you have to create jobs that female workers can access, because the labor force participation for men is at, again, as I said earlier, it's at a saturation point of 95%.
Thanks very much, and sadly I haven't read all 205 pages, and I imagine it's incredibly hard for a small firm who's busy trying to perform in the market to do that. And looking back in the past when Sri Lanka's employment growth was a bit faster, two of the drivers were the tourism and IT sectors. So I just wanted to pose a question to Sanjeeva on these two sectors, and how have these sectors evolved, and where do you see them going? Can they be the drivers of growth and jobs again?
So I think tourism, there is, in my view, tourism has no limits to how much we can drive growth. It can drive plenty of jobs, it can drive secondary rounds, so much of impact. IT is a little bit more complicated. IT is going through a global contraction right now for a variety of reasons, and one of which is artificial intelligence and its impact on productivity. And a lot of the IT innovation, the value creation, unfortunately Sri Lanka has followed very much follow India style algorithm for how we try to create value in IT, which is driven out of people, basically. Our primary income is IT services. But we are, in numbers wise, we can never compete with India or Bangladesh or Philippines or any of these other countries in IT-enabled services, because the number of people is far less that we have now. But the value creation opportunity that we have with creating intellectual property and creating a product-based go-to-market approach is much, much higher. If you look at the revenue per employee kind of number, an IT services company, an offshore IT services company makes somewhere between $30,000 to $45,000 per employee per year. The highest end software companies make $5-10 million per employee per year. The average software company makes about $250,000 plus per year. So that gap is what allows you to create higher value income, higher quality employment, and all of that. And we need to play into that one, and that's where our advantage is going to be. So that's one of the reasons why you see IT services, despite the sort of the promise of growth that the industry has proposed over the last 10 plus years, we haven't delivered on those numbers. And it's not, you can't, that one I don't blame government, saying government didn't do, government was giving a lot of incentive for IT industry, but IT industry didn't deliver because we are barking up the wrong tree in many ways in that. We need to bark up a different tree in order to deliver higher value.
Thanks very much. And as ever, there's these important lessons and observations from other large economies in this region. And thinking about that, how Sri Lanka can build its partnerships and how it can trade more with the region. And I just wanted to ask Francisca, what's the way forward for strengthening the resilience of the region's economies?
Thanks. Yeah. So there are two ways of strengthening resilience. One is short-term, one is long-term. So the short-term cyclical way is, of course, to just remove vulnerabilities, no? Build foreign reserves, reduce government debt, raise revenue ratios, just make sure that there's a sustainable government sector. That is one way of creating resilience, so the government then has the resources to actually help when help is needed. And it's not just the government, also the central bank has the resources to help when there are a lot of pressures. That takes time. So that's on the short term, to build resilience. In the long term, to build resilience is something that really emerged from our adaptation work. It's very clear, and it applies to adaptation, climate adaptation, as well as to other shocks. It's very clear that income, prosperity, development is one of the best ways of creating resilience. So addressing these structural things that are holding back development are key to a more resilient economy. So that includes women. All countries in the region, other than Bhutan and Nepal, all of them have women's employment ratios that are in the bottom quartile of emerging market and developing economies. All of them could raise their prosperity by employing these women. What a waste, no? Then there are the regulations that are holding people back. There's this lack of access to international markets. Maybe the Sri Lankan market is too small to provide what India provides, or maybe it could provide more. It could grow because it's small and there's a big market to enter. So there are a lot of structural things that are holding back firm growth and output growth with it, and job creation, private investment. In the end, the best way to make an economy and its people resilient is really to develop, to raise income.
Thanks very much. And sort of linking back to the Shamali on the employment laws you mentioned, and one of the key drivers of future growth is human capital and skills development. And I just wanted to pose a question to you on the labour laws and this informal employment that we have here in the region and in Sri Lanka, and whether this impacts on investment in people's skills, and whether we're on the right path to resolving that.
Well, informality in employment in Sri Lanka, rather 57.4% of employment is in the informal sector in Sri Lanka. And if you ask me what is informality defined by the Census and Statistics Department, it's lack of registration for benefits such as EPF, ETF, account keeping, and also to have, if you have less than 10 workers. So if you have more than half of your labor force employed in the informal sector, which has a very poor record of compliance with statutory obligations, and then you look at improving working conditions without that oversight of the labor inspectorate, then you are talking about the kind of jobs that are being created or which are existing, which don't have a decent working standard or decent work, as it were. So when you look at skills development, then you are looking at something that is really indefinite, because the formal sector has a fairly well-documented set of skills requirements. But where the informal sector is concerned, because there is such a high percentage, especially in agriculture, it's 87% is in the of employment is in the informal sector, then how do you plan for skills development? Because this is very often not permanent employment or not definite employment, it's seasonal. So you have a large cohort of workers who do not fall within the parameters of what is protected employment. So again, if you want to bring them within the law, you have to make it easier for employers to comply. Because right now, fair degree of evasion happens because the labor laws are so difficult to comply with. That's not true for everybody. Some, of course, experience it and looking at the cost factor. But when you look at, in terms of especially getting women into employment, if you are in the informal sector, you don't have social security very often, you don't have superannuation benefits, you don't have maternity benefits. So these are the factors that keep women out of employment. And you don't have the protections that come with harassment, to deal with harassment, discrimination, and sudden terminations and things like that. So informality really makes it both difficult to plan for skills development and manpower planning, as well as protecting workers.
Thank you very much. And so it just seems so crucial that the green shoots of this modest recovery turn into something with a better pace of growth and certainly a better pace of employment. And what I'd like to do now is have a concluding question for all our panelists, starting maybe with Sanjeeva at the far end. So looking ahead, how do you anticipate labour markets and employment trends evolving? And what reforms do you think will be necessary if we are to do better?
So I'm involved with this. There's a presidential committee called National Education Policy Reform, and there's a lot of work going on there to try to kind of look at the entire education system and see how we can evolve it into another level. One big challenge that we see is the perception of skilled workforce in our society. Mm-hmm. So in general, in Sri Lanka, I can ask anybody in this room, if you're in Sri Lanka and if you have a daughter, because this applies more in that direction than the other direction, would you be happy if your daughter were to marry a plumber? And the answer in Sri Lanka would be, for anybody in this room, would probably be like a heart attack, basically saying if that were to happen. It'd be a social, complete embarrassment. But if you ask a person in the middle room in Australia or in UK, that's not a problem of that nature, because we don't look at those people as being second class. And that's despite the fact that a plumber in Sri Lanka actually earns more than a school teacher. A graduate school teacher starts with a salary of 35,000 rupees a month. A plumber, a halfway decent plumber will earn that probably in 2 weeks. So it's not about the amount of money only, it's about the fact that our society has created this mindset that certain kind of people are not good enough, and at the same time our university admission rates, if you add up all the foreign admission and all the people going to private universities and various kinds of higher education, it actually does come close to 40%, according to the UGC numbers, which is pretty much where any developed economy is at. It's about 35 to 40% that OECD countries average at, basically. So we have a situation where a lot of the people who work in our economy are not recognized and respected and understood as being valuable contributors to society. And that mindset needs to change in order to come back to the skills education, in order to get to the point where these informal people are skilled, in order to drive further registration. A lot of these second-tier things have to come from, for me, fundamentally is education.
Thanks very much. And one of the statistics from the work done behind these presentations that shocked me was that only 2.8% of Sri Lankans can be labelled entrepreneurs. So, Mataza, in your answer to the question on what reforms are necessary, can you please also reflect on what hinders the movers and shakers from sort of taking up and recombining the factors of production, please?
My answer, I'll try to be concise as much as possible, but there's a few things to say here. The answer is platforms and aggregators. What do I mean? There was a seminal paper published by the McKinsey Global Institute in 1997 called Revolution in Interaction. What will happen if you can do your work in half the time? It was trying to forecast, we were relatively in the early age of this information revolution. They were trying to say that what were the technology trends and what would that do to the way work got done. And any product or service has an information content. So if technology allowed the effort or the cost of interaction to significantly come down, what would it do to the world? How would it transform the way work is done, the way markets work, whether you can shape markets, the whole new business formats, new products can happen. And it is now 27 years since that paper was published, and we can see many of the things that were predicted there happen. So let me bring that into a Sri Lankan context. Take, for example, the hospitality industry. I don't know how many people here know that more than 50% of the room inventory in the country are from establishments with less than 20 rooms. Right? Establishments with less than 5 rooms account for something like 30% of the inventory. And if not for these platforms like Booking.com or Agoda, which is owned by Booking, a lot of the long tail in tourism would never have happened. Because over 50% of the visitors who are coming to Sri Lanka are not necessarily residing in the formal sector, they are residing in the informal sector. And there were 3 A's that they were looking for. They were looking for affordability, which most people think it is, but they were looking for an authentic experience. They were looking for availability, because it was viable to have these establishments in new locations, which were not highly developed for tourism. So this is where this digital intervention completely disrupted the hospitality market. And Sri Lanka was a huge beneficiary. So the question was about entrepreneurship, right? So large number of people became entrepreneurs because the platform enabled them to come on the market. They could never sell their services. You could never find them. There was an uncertainty about what would that hotel room be? The digital platform solved those problems. Because the person who stayed in the room gave a review, they put a photograph. So the uncertainty, the information asymmetry problem got solved. Another example was these taxi hailing platforms that have come, basically. The productivity rate of a three-wheeler driver who is on a Pick Me or a Uber is 50 to 60% higher. So e-commerce really didn't take off in Sri Lanka. But that's a great opportunity for suppliers and buyers to interact through the platform. So one answer to the problem is we need more platforms so that you have small sellers and small buyers who can interact. The second issue is aggregators. And again, when the Harvard CID team came, they asked who are the large companies in Sri Lanka that organize and aggregate supply chains. And there were very few examples. So one problem with Sri Lanka is we are missing those large firms. Because what happens is a lot of small firms don't necessarily sell to the end consumer. They sell into big supply chains. So there are a lot more intermediate products in the world than final products. And in Sri Lanka, one example of aggregators is the modern trade, the supermarket. So if you take grocery retailing, modern trade is only 20% penetrated. Right? So the biggest problem that the SME sector has is retailing and distributing their product. So if the modern trade, which is 20% in a decade, becomes 40%, basically there will be ample opportunity for smaller entrepreneurs or new entrepreneurs because they are solving the problem of retailing and distributing. And they can do it at a significantly improved efficiency. Because if you take a product at the production point, at the factory gate, by the time it comes to the retailing point, it has almost doubled in value. So significant amount of inefficiency, wastage, etc. that happens in distribution and retailing with more productive players can be significantly improved. So if you have these two ecosystems, it will give an opportunity for many more entrepreneurs to come because the chances of them succeeding are significantly improved because these binding constraints that they have in distribution and retailing are solved.
Thank you very much. Now, as we conclude the panel, I'd like to ask Shamali for any further views. You've provided some incredible insights on employment already, but what do you think the steps are and reforms for us to do better in that arena?
Without a doubt, in this area, the state has to take the lead because Sri Lanka scores incredibly high on, especially for women, the Global Gender Gap Index on education and health attainment, which is based on the policy of universal free access to both education and health, with the results I immediately seen. But the picture is radically different on economic performance and political empowerment. I was amused to note that someone had put the gender empowerment bill up on the board when you have only 5% representation of women in parliament, despite more than 50% of the population being female. So it is ridiculous to speak of state policies or laws without having adequate representation in parliament, and how you do that has been talked to death. So that's a discussion for another day. But that's one of the important things, that women must both stand up and come to the table and also be elected into seats of decision making in order to make a change. Going back to the gender gap in labor force participation. But the state has to provide the lead here, same as it has been done for education and health, in providing the infrastructure for care, the care economy and the care facilities, because the private sector will not make it possible for those who need it most to access it, because there is a cost involved. One of the things that yesterday there was a very interesting study presented, commissioned by the ILO on the gender pay gap in Sri Lanka. And during that, the Secretary to the Ministry of Labour said, well, we have listened to women workers who say that they want to work, they want night work, because without that their incomes are limited, and therefore we are permitting it through the Draft Employment Act. That's all well and good, but how do you get back home after night work? If this conference was held in the evening, I would have a problem attending because I live in the boondocks in Kandy, and I have to look at ways and means of getting back because there are no trains after 8 o'clock or whatever back to Kandy, so I wouldn't be able to take public transport. So you have this situation where if you are making changes to labor law ostensibly to increase participation in situations like that, it has to come as part of a larger policy reform agenda where the government commits to improving infrastructure, access to all these facilities. And also jumping off on the point made by Murtaza on the platform economy and the growth in the informal sector in tourism. Can you imagine what happens in employment in that informal sector? Yes, it has been an advantage because of the availability of platforms for the economy to grow in that area. But what about the workers who work there? Because we are finding out more and more that those who are entering the labor market for the first time are going into platform work as a choice as against to going into wage employment at all. And that is very dangerous because the platform economy does not recognize these workers as employees. They are either independent contractors or service providers with none of the benefits and protections that have been established under labor law. So you have to be very careful. The state has to take the lead on this because without that you will have the kind of exploitative environment that we have tried very hard to overcome in the last 100 odd years since labor law began to be enacted as legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before we open up to the audience for Q&A, Francisca, have you got any final words on these important reforms to take us forward?
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting what this discussion has brought out is that there are two things that policymakers have to struggle with. First, what is in our report is about the quantity of jobs. But then several of my co-panelists have mentioned that what is just as important is the quality of jobs. You know, Shamali mentioned the informal sector. Sanjeeva mentioned the skilled versus unskilled labor, the plumber. Murtaza mentioned the productivity growth that can come, the higher wages and more productive workers that can come out of the gig, the digital platforms. So there are two dimensions that governments have to juggle. And I would give one plea for the general principle, anything that can increase competition, because it helps on both dimensions. So that could be things like special economic zones, like what Murtaza recommended. It could be easing the labor laws, or at least streamlining them. So there aren't 205 pages, or 6 pages of them. Something else, 26 pages, perhaps. Streamlining labor laws, making it easier to navigate all these permits that Murtaza mentioned and the barriers that Sanjeeva also mentioned. Anything that can take the sand out of the wheels, to create competition and generate both a bigger quantity and a bigger quality of jobs.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for this wealth of insight. So we're going to move on to some questions from the audience, but given we have such distinguished guests here in terms of the Secretary to Treasury and the Governor, we'd like to invite you up onto the stage as well. Some chairs are going to be there so that you can join the Q&A if that's okay, or you can stay in your seat if you'd prefer, but it would be wonderful to have your insights and comments on the questions that come forward. Thank you very much. If we could give them a round of applause if they join the stage. Okay. Now, wonderful. Hopefully we can start the process of questions. Have we got some roving mics?
Can I ask you?
Certainly, sir. Yeah.
Thank you for a very nice, useful presentation. I like the Francisca's presentation on South Asia growth, where you have basically shown where the South Asia this growth is, I mean, one of the sources of investment, public investment, and also and the issue that we have, especially countries like Sri Lanka, some other countries, because the resources no space for the public investment, and also given the fact that some countries like us, with higher poverty, domestic demand coming up in the, in the near future, only way is to get, as you said, trade and capital market open and access to other markets. when you look at South Asia, I mean, India has a bigger market. Even without opening, I think that's where I think they are growing higher. Whereas for countries like surrounding countries, for us to benefit, I think we probably, based on your thesis, hypothesis, India is a market that needs to be opened up for trade and capital, much more integration, so that both countries, both region can benefit, like what happened in Asia and all this more integrated region. So in your view, how likely, what is the possibility of, so now South Asia has always been a very restrictive, closed economics compared to later other regions. And even in opening up of trade and capital, especially Indian market to others, is, I think, what is your expectation that can come to a level of, say, other regions, say, Southeast Asia? And that, I think, one thing that will benefit the region, if not for the other markets, I think, so that certainly will have a bigger, for like Sri Lanka, access to trade and more capital coming from there, so basically even regional countries. But looking at the evolution of opening the economy, especially India, I think, I mean, what is your expectation that, how long it would take where this integration? And one thing at India, I'd like to see, they are promoting the payment and settlement, promoting the currency in the region. Without opening trade and capital flows, I think it's kind of opening something that you need to open last, but opening it first. So I think that this is something that I would like to have your views. Thank you.
Please, Francisca, if you want to start with that question from the governor.
Yeah, gladly. Yeah, it's true. India is a big market, but around South Asia, there are more trade restrictions and even FDI restrictions than in other countries, other emerging markets and developing economies. I don't know what the plan is for India to open to trade, but a lot of the trade costs, even if you find that a big market, whether it's China or India or America, even if a big market doesn't necessarily reduce its tariffs, there are a lot of things countries can do to encourage trade. So in a different publication, not in this one, we've shown that the average trade cost in South Asia is 140%. It's the equivalent of a tariff of 140%, of which the tariff is 1/10. Most of the trade costs are actually shipping, logistics, monopoly rents, it's other things. And though it's documentation requirements, we heard about all the red tape here in various areas, labor markets, special economic zones, permits. So there are a lot of things that countries can do to encourage trade without having to engage in these difficult, very contentious bilateral discussions. It can be just a unilateral reduction of obstacles, administrative sand in the wheels that can help encourage trade, even if the other side doesn't do much. But I wish I could tell you everyone's going to open up very soon. I'm not so sure. We're certainly calling for it. On the capital controls, yes, of course these things have to be faced. There's a myriad of examples. At some point we looked at all the examples of financial liberalizations, and since the 70s, and yes, a lot of them ended up in financial crisis. So capital account opening has to be done in a careful way, but you begin by FDI, of course, always the long-term flows before the short-term. But you're absolutely right, it has to be done carefully.
Thanks very much. And I just wondered, ST, do you have a question or a comment before we go to the hands in the audience, please?
Thank you. In fact, I don't have any specific question, but thank you for the excellent two presentations, particularly the Sri Lanka situation, and also the way the World Bank is basically seeing it, and also the potential. And one of the sort of comments that I want to highlight here is that you in fact have, I think I should go through the details, but you have sort of identified that the country is trying its best to implement the reforms,
to me, these are, much needed reforms, but much delayed reforms. Due to various reasons, I should say, mainly to political reasons. And also there was no sort of, commitment in the past to implement these reforms and consistently, follow those policies. So that's why right now we are paying the price in terms of a crisis. That is my very simple sort of analysis when it's come to the, finding some solution to this crisis. And at the same time, you covered a lot of, reforms that we are implementing in the financial side, in the fiscal side, and the structural side. All these reforms are necessary, but the problem is that implementing and also introducing these reforms is a serious challenge. There are a lot of, hindrances, a lot of challenges, and there will be a lot of areas where you have to be basically concerned about, and also you have to be careful. And at the same time, as you very correctly indicated, I think in the second presentation, there are a lot of implications when you're basically trying to implement this policy. So sequencing and be careful with some of the other implications is also very important. And at the same time, one should recognize the fact that implementing this sort of an entire sort of gamut of reforms, there could be shortcomings. So it is up to the relevant parties to basically come into the discussion or basically highlight all this whatever the areas that will have to be addressed when you're implementing these reforms is very important. And the final point I want to highlight is that implementing these sort of reforms in a relatively small period of time is difficult. So that's why you see some reforms have been front-loaded even under the IMF program, and there'll be some other reforms that would be implemented subsequently. For example, our original objective was to basically firstly stabilize the economy, which we are seeing the positive signs of that, and also we want to basically solidify that as well. And then as a second step to basically implement these reforms, particularly most of the reforms that you indicated in your presentation, to basically get the growth back and to basically sustain growth in the period ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, do we have any questions from our audience for the distinguished panel? If I can have some help with the mic Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and wonderful presentations, wonderful panel. Thank you very much. Just a quick question. One of the things is, we are encouraging people to go abroad at all skill levels for our remittances. So we agree the remittances have increased. But the question is, should we then open up the labor markets to allow foreign labor to come in? Is a question, so that, we can get, I know, for example, doctors are leaving, but we can't get foreign doctors to work here. So, anyone in the panel, can they respond?
Thanks very much, and I'll field a couple of others if they're there. Is there any other questions? I'll give people a moment. So maybe starting with Telsa on the very far end, have you got a response? And then other panelists, feel free to chime in.
Most definitely, yes. For 10 years, basically, this has been discussed. International level economy, Shantha Devarajan has been writing papers, and he has been advocating that in certain skills categories, there's a huge labor shortage. Bringing in foreign labor into Sri Lanka is extremely difficult. If you are a BOI company, there are certain these things. But as Ricardo Hausmann says, you need tacit knowledge. And tacit knowledge resides in the brains of people. And if Sri Lankans don't have it, you have to bring foreigners in. And there are gaps in tacit knowledge all over the economy, basically. But it is an extremely difficult way
to handle the immigration to bring the people in. Because if you work for a BOI company, then the BOI can recommend to give the visa. But if you are not a BOI company, it is a very difficult thing. And if you are a free agent, it is even more difficult. But having said that, we do have foreign labor in Sri Lanka, that the Chinese contractors bring in Chinese labor, the Indian contractors bring in Indian laborers. Many hotels have foreign chefs. Certain skill categories are coming, but I think what we have to do is we have to make the process much more easier.
Thanks very much. And anyone else on the panel have a view on that?
Side?
Yeah, so before I answer on the IT side, let me also say that as a country, yes, we rely on this foreign exchange earning from people working in other countries, but that is not that cannot be our purpose in Sri Lanka. Cannot be we make babies, we educate them, we make them out, send them out to go and work for somebody else. That's not a good goal for Sri Lanka. Our goal should be people in Sri Lanka have a fulfilling and value-creating life in Sri Lanka. And if they want to go somewhere else, that's fine. But right now, majority of the people who leave the country are not leaving for that latter reason. Many of them are leaving because they can't get a respected, well-paying, sufficient income-generating facility in Sri Lanka. So that is something that's a structural improvement that has to happen. Part of it is not just the amount of money. As I said earlier, a teacher gets paid less than, and many government officials get paid less than what skilled workers get paid in Sri Lanka, but yet they are not sufficiently satisfied with their position. So that's a respect issue. There are other angles that have to be done. So I agree with Murtaza, what he said about the ability to bring in skilled workers at a high end. It is not really, if you're a BOI company, there is a process, but it's quite doable. If you're not a BOI company, there is a process. It is doable, and it does happen. On the low end, it's much more difficult. And other than for this kind of construction, hotel kind of industries where it's very, very prevalent. You can go to any construction site, you'll see a lot of Indian workers, Bangladeshi workers, quite a lot. But on skilled areas like IT, again, comes down to the strategy. If the strategy that we're trying to implement is we want to have more people work in Sri Lanka so we get more hourly work brought to Sri Lanka, these are two different things. Now your scenario was doctors are leaving, we need people. Murtaza was saying tacit knowledge, we need those gaps filled. That's a very different problem from saying we need to import workers to Sri Lanka and then do services with those workers and export those services back out. That is not really adding much value on a long-term basis to economic development in Sri Lanka. Certainly it gives a profit margin, so it is not a bad thing to do, but it's not a scalable development strategy for Sri Lanka on a long-term basis, in my opinion.
Could I just add something?
Please, Shimon.
Thank you. To a different perspective really about migration for employment from Sri Lanka. It's now down to about, women migrating for employment is down to about 30%, but out of the 30%, 95% or close to that amount migrate for unskilled or domestic work into dangerous situations very often. And it's also, I think, a research study carried out some time ago into the SLBFE notices, the vacancy notices by licensed employment agencies, found that Sri Lanka only fills 15% of skilled vacancies that are offered to Sri Lankan citizens. So there is a problem here. When we speak of out-migration, you have to look at the type of work that Sri Lankan workers migrate for, and is that the kind of work, as Sanjeeva pointed out very rightly, that we want them to migrate for. Look at that in the context of the findings today presented by the World Bank, that families are going into debt in order to find their nutritional requirements, food and nutrition. This should appall all of us, because the consequence of that will be migration and into very often dangerous conditions. With regard to inward migration, there's certainly nothing in the law to prevent that. But as Murtaza and Sanjeev both pointed out, there have been procedural difficulties. But we had to also make sure that the type of workers that are brought in are not being exploited because they are invisible to the system. They can be very easily got rid of if they claim benefits such as EPF, ETF, which we have seen in the past, because the employer can simply cancel the visa and they have to leave or they are deported, so that they can't stay in the system long enough to make a claim, for instance, for unpaid EPF. So it must not be a race to the bottom, as it were, It must be with the requisite protections if they are being brought in with certain, that they are entitled to the same benefits as the Sri Lankan workers and the same protections. Because if we do have the law, then we must make sure that it is applied irrespective of nationality, because otherwise that would be discriminatory, and also that it is not a way to evade and exploit someone who's coming into work in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think there's been a wealth of information shared on the panel and in the reports, and I certainly will enjoy going into further detail. So just want to ask for a big round of applause for everyone on the panel, please, for the insights they've shared.
Thank you very much to
Thank
our
you very
panelists
much.
and our speakers. Yes, you may resume to your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, we also do have an online audience who are very much actively participating on today's event. We say thank you to you for tuning in. And in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, we have the Chief Executive Officer of the Sri Lanka Press Institute to deliver the closing remarks. He's the current Chief Executive Officer and an independent media organization based in Colombo with over 2 decades of experience in the media industry, and is recognized as one of the leading figures in Sri Lanka's media landscape. Before taking the helm at the Sri Lanka Press Institute, he worked as a journalist, news editor and executive editor at several leading media organizations in Sri Lanka, and also served as the executive director of the Press Complaints Commission of Sri Lanka, and was a member of the Sri Lanka Press Institute's Board of Directors. Could you please put your hands together for Mr. Kumar Lopez, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, good afternoon. For those of you who have ulcers and gastritis, let me give you a good news. My speech is not going to be too long, right? So we could actually go ahead for early lunch. And Mr. Sanjeeva, like if you find a good, very prosperous, rich plumber, do let me know because I have 3 daughters. So probably. But anyway, it will be the daughters, their choice, okay. So it was a very, very interesting panel discussion, and I've been listening to the reports from Francisca and Richard in the morning as well, which has been very insightful with a lot of details and content, and I'm sure it will be very useful for us as we go on and progress in this year. And what is interesting to note is that during the panel discussion, some of the information and the key findings that were there in the reports also echoed again, although it's from the Sri Lankan point of view. So for example, like we talk about one of the key takeaways from the South Asian Development update is the need for private investment and the impact of climate change, the need for more adoption of climate change. A clear example was brought in by Mr. Jafferji, who basically spoke about how the rain affected the construction field in Sri Lanka, which is a clear indication as to how climate change is impacting. And one of the ways that we could actually tackle it is by having more adaptation, private sectors, the public sector, and the government sector looking at more adaptation of climate change so that we could actually have a better economy and better growth. The other point that I would want to see here is the need to have more non-agriculture jobs. Non-agriculture jobs was brought up by Francisca in her note, and also it's mentioned in the report as well, which also comes out in the discussions Ms. Srimali was also talking, where we need to have more women participating in the new in the skill sets of jobs, in the new skills, in the new area of employment, where women need to come into the fray more so that we can actually make the best out of it. So we are looking at gender equality. We are talking about more opportunities for women to come into the fray of employment so that that could also strengthen the employment. Going back to the Sri Lankan update, right? So I would basically term it as a long test match, right? We are going to play that 2 innings. It's not going to end. I know the IPL has started. There's a T20 game, but where Sri Lanka is, we are not in a T20 game, right? We are in a long innings. Probably it could be the Ashes, like I'm ready to play 5 tests or whatsoever, right? But the cover page, the image you would find, it talks about the bridge to recovery, right? The bridge to recovery is a clear indication to say that we have not crossed the bridge. We are in the middle of the bridge. We are still recovering. There are good signs of progress that has been made. It is stabilizing, but while there's something to celebrate, we also need to be aware of the fact that there are challenges that have been identified. And these challenges came out with the panel discussion also, stating that we need to look at the reforms, the policies, the interventions of the government, interventions of the private sector and the public sector, and the need to have more coordination, right? The need to have more collaboration towards coming out of this challenge. Because one of the biggest, the risk or the biggest highlight or sadly the downfall is that the rise in the poverty level, which is going to be about 22%. At the moment it's indicated according to the report, it would stay at 22% in Sri Lanka until 2026. Although at the moment it's a little higher, but it is indicated it will be around 22%, the poverty level in Sri Lanka. So that's an area that we need to work on. So we're talking about coordination, we're talking about aggregating, and then from my point of view, from the communication point of view, I think it also becomes a challenge to communicate the right information out, getting the data out, the story out, so that people understand, so that we can work together, right? I think the government alone cannot work, the private sector cannot work, the public cannot work alone. We all need to come together so that we can work collaboratively, coordinating, so that we could actually come out of this, the current challenge that we have. Today being the fact-checking day, it's a challenge that we all face. The challenge of trying to see which is the right information, which is a malinformation, which is a misinformation. So tackling false information becomes a huge challenge in today's context, right? The mainstream media is there, but then you also have the private, the social media and the other forms of media which are also pouring out information. So that tackling this information amidst all this, getting that right information going out, there's going to be another challenge. Months ahead, I think we're all looking forward for that, for those interesting moments ahead in this year for Sri Lanka, the period of elections. We do not know whether we'll have elections or not, but nevertheless, I think that would be one of the risks that have been identified and which is coming out from the Sri Lankan update. How do we ensure that we sustain these reforms, sustain policies, so that we can come out of these economic struggles? So it's going to be a long innings. And the match is not over until the last ball is bowled. So while we celebrate these small wins, I think we still have a long way to go. These are the messages that I was able to compile with, coming out from the panel discussion as well as coming from the reports. If I missed anything, speakers, please pardon me. And I would like to thank the World Bank, Mr. Faris and Chair for inviting us to be part of this important event. And we hope that the next update would be a much more, a strong and a pleasant one where we could celebrate much more with a cocktail, I guess. All right. Thank you, guys. Good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kumar Lopez. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we conclude today's event. While we say thank you to all of you for joining us here this afternoon, we wish you have a very pleasant evening, day, and also to say thank you to our online audience. Thank you very much for joining in as well. Now, if you want to download the Sri Lanka update, the QR code will be up on screen in a few minutes, and you can feel free to download it and share it amongst your friends as well. Please feel free to join us for lunch soon. Thank you.